In the summer of 1941, the quiet parish communities along Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin were unsettled by the disappearance of two young sisters. Marie and Celeste Boudreaux had vanished without a trace while swimming in the Bayou's dark waters, leaving behind only their torn clothing scattered along the muddy shore. But 25 years later, when fisherman Joe Trosclair's nets snagged something unnatural in those same murky depths, he would uncover evidence so disturbing it would lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The morning mist hung thick over the water as Joe guided his flat-bottomed boat through the cypress channels. August heat was already pressing down despite the early hour, and sweat beaded along his weathered forehead. He'd been working these waters for 40 years, since he was barely 16, and knew every submerged log and shallow sandbar by heart. The first tug on his net felt wrong. Not the familiar weight of catfish or the sharp resistance of a snapping turtle, but something heavy and unyielding that seemed to pull back against his efforts. Joe's calloused hands worked the rope muscles, straining as he hauled upward through the black water. Metal clinked against the boat's aluminum side as the net broke the surface. Rusted chains emerged first, crusted with decades of sediment and trailing dark water weeds. Then came the bones, yellowed and pitted unmistakably human. A skull rolled free from the tangled mass, empty sockets, staring up at the grey morning sky. Joe's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he reached for the radio, but something glinted among the remains that made him pause. A delicate silver bracelet encircled one of the skeletal wrists, its surface tarnished, but still bearing the faint inscription, MB, with love, grand-père. The old fisherman had heard the stories passed down through a generation of whispered conversations. Two young girls who'd gone swimming one evening and never came home. Their grandfather Alcide Boudreaux searching the bayou day after day for 25 years, calling their names into the endless maze of waterways. Joe's radio crackled to life in his shaking hands. The dispatcher's voice seemed to come from another world as he reported his grim discovery. In the distance, a great blue heron lifted from the water with a harsh cry, its wings beating against the heavy air like an ancient warning finally released. Within an hour, the bayou swarmed with activity that hadn't been seen in these remote waters since the original search 25 years ago. Detective Paul Broussard stepped carefully from the police launch onto Joe's boat, his leather shoes slipping slightly on the wet deck. At 43, Broussard had investigated his share of drownings and accidents in Louisiana's waterways, but something about this scene felt different, more deliberate. "You haven't touched anything else?" Broussard asked, studying the skeletal remains still tangled in the fishing net. Joe shook his head, his face pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. "Just the bracelet there. Soon as I seen it, I knew." Joe's voice cracked slightly. "Them Boudreaux girls, Lord have mercy." Broussard was photographing the remains when he heard another boat approaching through the cypress grove. An elderly man navigated a small pirogue with surprising skill, his white hair catching the filtered sunlight. Even before the boat drew alongside, Broussard recognized Alcide Boudreaux from newspaper photographs, the devoted grandfather who had never stopped searching. "Detective!" Alcide's voice carried a tremor of hope and dread. "Is it true? Have you found my granddaughters?" The old man's hands gripped the pirogue's sides as he studied the remains, his weathered face etched with 25 years of grief. Alcide wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, remarkably clean for someone who spent his days combing the swamplands. A small brass button gleamed at his collar, polished to a mirror shine despite the humid air. "We can't confirm anything yet, Mr. Boudreaux," Broussard said gently, though the silver bracelet made identification almost certain. "But we'll need you to—" "That's Marie's bracelet." Alcide's voice broke. "I gave it to her for her 13th birthday. Had it engraved at Thibodaux's jewellery shop in town. His eyes filled with tears, but there was something else there too, a flicker of what might have been relief. We'll need formal identification, but yes, it appears 25 years. Alcide wiped his eyes with a handkerchief that seemed oddly pristine. 25 years I've been searching these waters. Every morning, every evening. People said I should give up, that they were gone. But a grandfather knows. A grandfather never stops looking. The old man's devotion was evident in every word, every gesture. Yet something nagged at Broussard as he watched Alcide's careful movements, the way his eyes never quite met the detective's directly. Back at the parish station, Broussard spread the old case files across his desk like pieces of a decades-old puzzle. The original investigation had been thorough for its time, but limited by 1940s technology and the chaotic nature of wartime Louisiana. Alcide sat across from him, hands folded patiently, occasionally dabbing his eyes with that same pristine handkerchief. "Tell me about that evening," Broussard said, opening the yellowed folder. "June 15th, 1941. Alcide's voice took on the practiced cadence of a story told many times. It was a Friday. Marie had just finished her lessons with Sister Catherine at the convent school. Celeste was helping her mother with the washing. Such good girls, detective. Never gave anyone trouble. The original report painted a picture of normalcy shattered. The sisters had asked permission to go swimming after supper, a common request during the sweltering Louisiana summer. Their mother, Evangeline, had reluctantly agreed, warning them to stay close to shore and return before dark. They took the path behind our house. Alcide continued, his fingers absently polishing the brass button at his collar. Down through the cypress grove to the swimming hole. I watched them go from my workshop window. Marie was wearing that blue dress, the one with tiny flowers. Celeste had on her yellow sundress. Broussard studied a hand-drawn map from the original file. The swimming spot was isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through dense undergrowth. Perfect for privacy, but also perfect for concealment. When did you realize they were missing? Evangeline sent me to fetch them when supper grew cold. That was around 7:30. Alcide's voice tightened. I found their clothes on the bank, torn and scattered. Their undergarments were... He paused, unable to continue. The original investigators had documented the scene meticulously. The girls' dresses were shredded as if torn away violently. Signs of a struggle marked the muddy bank, deep gouges in the earth, broken cypress knees scattered personal items. But no bodies, no witnesses, no clear indication of what had happened. 3 men were questioned extensively. Broussard noted, flipping through witness statements. Henri Thibodaux, Father Baptiste, and your daughter's son Claude. Alcide nodded slowly. Each had reason to be near the bayou that evening. Each had, he struggled with the words, questionable character. But in 25 years, detective, not one of them confessed. Not one showed remorse. Outside, thunder rumbled across the parish, and the first drops of afternoon rain spattered against the station windows. The rain drummed steadily against the station roof as Broussard reviewed the 3 suspects who had dominated the original investigation. Each man possessed motive opportunity and disturbing characteristics that made them viable candidates for the girl's disappearance. Henri Thibodaux had been 34 in 1941, a solitary trapper who worked the bayou's remote channels. Multiple witnesses placed him near the swimming hole that evening, checking his trap lines. What made Henri particularly suspicious were his detailed journal's meticulous records of local wildlife that included uncomfortably specific observations about the Boudreaux sisters' swimming habits. Henri knew when those girls would be in the water. Sheriff Gautreaux had noted in his original report, wrote down their schedules like he was tracking deer. Drew pictures too, sketches of young girls that weren't what you'd call innocent. Father Baptiste presented a different kind of disturbing possibility. The parish priest had been 41, a man who'd served the community faithfully for 15 years. But beneath his clerical collar lurked a tortured soul battling inappropriate desires. His personal journals, discovered later, contained anguished entries about temptation and resisting the devil's whispers regarding innocent lambs. The third suspect hit closest to home. Claude Moreau, the girl's stepbrother, had returned from a 2-year prison sentence just weeks before the disappearance. At 22, he carried deep resentment toward his stepsisters, whom he viewed as pampered favourites in a household where he'd never belonged. Claude hated those girls, Alcide said quietly, his fingers still working that brass button, always muttering about how they got everything while he got nothing. His mother spoiled them terribly after their father died. The old man's voice carried a note of disapproval that seemed oddly out of place for such a devoted grandfather. Broussard studied the photographs of the 3 men, Henri's hollow eyes and unkempt beard, Father Baptiste's gaunt features and haunted expression, Claude's sullen scowl and clenched fists. Each face told a story of potential violence of men capable of terrible acts. The strange thing, Broussard mused, is how perfectly each suspect fits a different theory. Henri the predator, Father Baptiste, the fallen priest, Claude, the jealous stepbrother. Almost like... He paused, something nagging at his mind. Alcide waited patiently, dabbing his forehead with that spotless handkerchief, despite the station's cool air. Outside, lightning illuminated the parish courthouse, casting stark shadows through the rain-streaked windows. The next morning, Broussard drove the winding back roads to Henri Thibodaux's cabin, a weathered structure that squatted among the cypress trees like a forgotten relic. Alcide had insisted on accompanying him, claiming his knowledge of the local families might prove useful. The old man sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at the dense swampland that pressed close to the gravel road. Henri emerged from his cabin before they'd even parked, as if he'd been watching their approach. At 59, the trapper looked older than his years, his face mapped with deep lines and his grey beard unkempt. His clothes carried the perpetual smell of muskrat pelts and stagnant water. "Been expecting you," Henri said, spitting tobacco juice into the weeds, his small eyes fixed on Alcide with obvious discomfort. "Heard old Joe pulled something up from the deep water." Broussard noted how Henri's gaze lingered on Alcide with what might have been fear. The old man remained perfectly composed, hands clasped behind his back, that brass button catching the morning light. "We'd like to see your journals from 1941, Broussard said. Henri led them inside the dim cabin past walls lined with animal traps and yellowed hunting licenses. The journals were stored in a wooden chest that reeked of mildew and decay. Henri's handwriting was surprisingly neat, documenting trap locations, weather patterns, and animal movements with obsessive detail. But scattered throughout the practical entries were disturbing observations. Boudreaux girl swimming again, 3:30 p.m. Marie wore the blue dress stays in water longer than Celeste. Celeste has small birthmark on left shoulder visible when she dives. The sketches were worse. Crude but unmistakably lewd drawings of young female figures, some labelled with initials that could easily be MB and CB. "You watch those girls regularly," Broussard observed. Henri's jaw worked nervously. "Man gets lonely out here. Wasn't hurting nobody by looking." "These drawings suggest otherwise." "Drawing ain't touching," Henri snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Besides, plenty of folks knew those girls' habits. They swam most every evening when weather was good. Alcide spoke for the first time since entering the cabin. "The swimming hole was quite isolated, Henri. How often did you really see them there?" Something in the old man's tone made Henri flinch. "Often enough," he muttered, avoiding Alcide's steady gaze. But I wouldn't hurt children. You know that, Mr. Boudreaux?" The deference in Henri's voice was unmistakable, as was the fear beneath it. Broussard filed away this observation as they prepared to leave. St. Bartholomew's Church stood like a white sentinel against the grey afternoon sky, its simple steeple piercing the low-hanging clouds. Father Baptiste had aged poorly in the 25 years since the girl's disappearance. His once dark hair, now silver, his face gaunt and deeply lined. When Broussard and Alcide found him in the sacristy, the priest was polishing brass candlesticks with trembling hands. "Detective," Father Baptiste said without looking up, "I heard about the discovery. Poor children, poor sweet children." The priest's office smelled of incense and old paper crucifixes lining the walls like silent witnesses. Father Baptiste sat heavily in his chair, hands folded in his lap to hide their shaking. Alcide took a seat near the window sunlight, catching the brass button at his collar as he observed the proceedings with quiet intensity. "We found journal pages with the remains," Broussard began. "Handwriting analysis confirms some belonged to you." Father Baptiste's face crumpled. "I threw those pages in the Bayou years ago. I prayed they would decompose, become nothing. But water preserves what we wish to forget. Tell me about the entries. About resisting temptation." The priest's voice dropped to a whisper. "I fought against it every day. The devil whispers to us all, detective, but some of us hear him more clearly. Those girls, Marie and Celeste, they were so pure, so innocent, and God forgive me, I had thoughts, terrible, sinful thoughts." Alcide shifted slightly in his chair, and Broussard noticed the old man's knuckles had gone white where he gripped the armrests. "The evening they disappeared," Father Baptiste continued, "I was walking the Bayou paths, trying to clear my head after seeing them at evening mass. They looked so beautiful in their Sunday dresses. I fought the urge to follow them to the swimming hole, fought it with prayer and penance. But what if I lost that battle? What if in a moment of weakness—" His voice broke completely. "I've lived with that uncertainty for 25 years, not knowing if I'm a murderer or just a sinner." "Where exactly were you that evening?" Broussard pressed. "Wandering the cypress paths, wrestling with my demons. No witnesses except God himself." Father Baptiste looked up at Alcide with desperate eyes. "You must believe me, old friend." "I may be damned, but I never touched those children." Alcide's response was barely audible. "Only God knows what's in a man's heart, Baptiste." Claude Moreau lived in a shotgun house on the wrong side of Thibodaux, its peeling paint and sagging porch reflecting 25 years of hard living. When Broussard knocked, the door opened to reveal a man whose youthful anger had curdled into middle-aged bitterness. At 47, Claude's face bore the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working odd jobs and nursing grievances. "Figured you'd come around eventually," Claude said, not bothering to invite them inside. He leaned against the doorframe arms, crossed his eyes, narrowing, when he spotted Alcide standing behind the detective. "We need to discuss your whereabouts on June 15th, 1941, Broussard began. Claude's laugh was harsh. "Same thing I told the sheriff back then. I was drinking at Boudouin's bar until they threw me out around 9. Then I walked home through the bayou because it was cooler than the road. That path would have taken you past the swimming hole. Might have. Was pretty drunk." Claude's gaze fixed on Alcide with undisguised hostility. "But I suppose the old man here told you I hated those girls." Alcide remained silent, but his fingers worried that brass button again, a nervous habit Broussard was beginning to notice. "The journal pages found with the remains," Broussard continued, "contain entries about your stepsisters, very bitter entries." Claude's face darkened. "Yeah, I wrote about them. So what?" They got everything handed to them while I got kicked around like a stray dog. Mama treated them like little princesses while I slept in the shed. The journal entries had been particularly vicious. Rants about spoiled brats and Mama's precious angels, who would get what's coming to them. One passage had been especially disturbing. They think they're so special swimming in their fancy underclothes. Maybe somebody should teach them what the real world's like. That sounds like a threat, Broussard observed. Words ain't actions, Claude snapped. I was mad drunk most of the time back then. Doesn't mean I killed anybody. Alcide finally spoke, his voice carefully measured. Claude always had a temper. Even as a boy, he couldn't control his anger when things didn't go his way. Something flickered across Claude's face, not just anger, but something closer to fear. You're one to talk about anger, old man. The words hung in the humid air like a challenge. Alcide's expression never changed, but Broussard noticed the old man's hand had moved to his pocket, fingers tracing something there. What's that supposed to mean? Broussard asked. Claude glanced between them, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. Nothing. Just 25 years is a long time to carry hate. That evening, Broussard accepted Alcide's invitation to share coffee at the old Boudreaux homestead. The house sat on a rise overlooking the Bayou, its wraparound porch offering views of the very waters where the girls had vanished. Despite its age, the property was immaculately maintained, white paint, gleaming gardens, precisely tended, not a weed in sight. My wife, Amélie, always kept a beautiful home, Alcide said, leading Broussard inside. After she passed, I tried to maintain her standards. The girls loved visiting here. The interior reflected the same meticulous care. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece in perfect symmetry. Marie and Celeste, at various ages, always smiling, always perfectly groomed. Alcide moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, his movements precise and controlled. They spent every summer here after their father died. Alcide continued, settling into a worn leather chair. Sweet children. Sweet. Obedient. They understood the importance of proper behavior. Broussard studied a photograph of the girls in their Sunday dresses, noting how young and vulnerable they appeared. You were very close to them. A grandfather's duty is to guide his grandchildren detective, to protect them from the world's corruption. Alcide's fingers returned to that brass button, polishing it absently. I taught them to swim in those very waters, showed them which areas were safe, which currents to avoid. It must have been devastating when they disappeared. Beyond words, Alcide arose and walked to an antique secretary desk, pulling out a small, velvet-lined box. I've kept this as a memorial to my son, their father. He collected brass buttons from his military service. The collection was impressive, dozens of brass buttons in various sizes and designs, each polished to mirror brightness. Broussard noticed several bore initials J.B. for Jacques Boudreaux, A.B. for Alcide himself and others from different military units. Jacques was so proud of his uniform, Alcide said, holding up a particularly ornate button. He'd spend hours polishing these before inspections. I suppose I inherited that particular obsession. The old man's laugh was soft, almost fond, but something in his eyes remained hard and distant. As he returned the collection to its box, Broussard noticed how his hands lingered over each piece, caressing the metal with an almost intimate familiarity. Those girls trusted you completely, Broussard observed, as they should have. Alcide's voice carried a note of absolute certainty. I would have done anything to protect them, anything at all. Outside, the bayou whispered against the shore, carrying secrets in its dark currents. The forensics lab in Baton Rouge had worked through the weekend to analyze the waterlogged journal found with Marie's remains. Doctor, Sarah Comeau spread the evidence across her examination table like pieces of a macabre jigsaw puzzle, each page photographed and preserved under protective glass. It's remarkable how well the Bayou preserved certain elements. Dr. Comeau explained to Broussard. The leather cover created a sealed environment for some pages, while others suffered complete deterioration. The surviving pages told a disturbing story. Henri's hunting schedules were documented in his distinctive handwriting with specific notations about the girls' swimming patterns. Father Baptiste's confessional entries appeared on torn pages from what seemed to be his personal prayer book, the ink faded but legible. Claude's bitter rants covered several loose sheets, the paper quality suggesting they'd been torn from a composition notebook. What strikes me as unusual, Dr. Comeau continued, is how these different writing samples were preserved. Usually different paper types and ink compositions would degrade at varying rates underwater. But these all show similar deterioration patterns. Broussard studied the evidence through the magnifying glass. Something nagged at him about the arrangement, how conveniently each suspect was represented, how perfectly the evidence seemed distributed. How long would it take for this level of preservation? He asked. In Bayou conditions, these pages would need to be in a completely sealed environment for the first several years, then gradually exposed to water. Almost like they were stored somewhere dry, then deliberately submerged later. The timeline bothered Broussard more than he could articulate. Henri's journal entries about the girls were dated throughout 1941. But the handwriting analysis showed they were written with different pens, some ballpoint, others fountain pen. Father Baptiste's prayer book pages contained references to events that occurred after the girl's disappearance. Most puzzling was Claude's material. The composition paper showed no signs of the aging it should have displayed after 25 years underwater. The ink was too fresh, the paper too white beneath the water damage. Doctor, in your professional opinion, could these items have been placed with the remains at different times? Dr. Comeau nodded slowly. It's possible. The chain securing the skeleton shows signs of being disturbed and resecured. Someone with knowledge of underwater preservation could have staged this evidence. Broussard thought about Alcide's meticulous nature, his obsession with order and control. The old man knew these waters better than anyone had spent 25 years searching every channel and backwater. He would have known exactly where to place evidence, how to preserve it, when to release it. The brass button bearing AB initials suddenly took on new significance. Broussard sat in his patrol car outside the forensics lab, staring at the photographs of the brass button. The small piece of metal seemed to mock him with its pristine condition despite 25 years underwater. The initials AB were perfectly legible, etched deep into the brass surface, with the kind of professional engraving found in military collections. He thought about Alcide's button collection displayed so proudly just hours earlier. The old man's obsession with polishing each piece to mirror brightness, his intimate knowledge of every button's origin and significance, the way his fingers had lingered over each one, caressing the metal with practiced familiarity. Pulling out his phone, Broussard called the lab. Dr. Comeau, I need you to examine that brass button again. Specifically, I want to know about tool marks from the engraving process. 20 minutes later, she called back with confirmation of his suspicions. The engraving is recent, detective. Within the last 5 to 10 years, based on the tool marks and the lack of appropriate corrosion. Someone added those initials long after the button was manufactured. Broussard's mind raced through the implications. Alcide hadn't just been searching the Bayou. For 25 years he'd been managing it. Controlling the narrative, planting evidence, steering suspicion toward 3 convenient suspects, while maintaining his own image as the devoted grieving grandfather. The journal pages made sense now. Alcide had collected them over the years, stealing Henri's hunting records, taking Father Baptiste's discarded prayer book pages, gathering Claude's bitter writings. He'd preserved them carefully, then staged their discovery with Marie's remains to create the perfect crime scene. But why now? What had changed? After 25 years, Broussard remembered Joe the fisherman mentioning that Alcide had seemed different lately, more agitated, less focused in his daily searches. Several townspeople had noted the old man's increasing confusion, his occasional lapses in memory. Early-stage dementia perhaps making him worry that his secret might slip out before he could control its revelation one final time. The brass button was his insurance policy evidence that would point away from him while satisfying the community's need for closure. He'd engraved his own initials on it, planning to claim it belonged to his deceased son, Jacques, a red herring within the red herrings. But Alcide had made one crucial mistake. In his meticulous planning, he'd forgotten that modern forensics could detect recent engraving work. His obsession with order and control had betrayed him. Broussard started the engine and headed back toward the Boudreaux homestead. It was time to confront a killer who had hidden behind 25 years of apparent devotion. Darkness had settled over the Boudreaux homestead when Broussard returned, but warm light spilled from the kitchen windows where Alcide sat at his dining table, methodically polishing brass buttons. The old man looked up without surprise when Broussard knocked, as if he'd been expecting this final visit. "Detective," Alcide said, setting down his polishing cloth with practiced precision. "I assume you've made some discoveries." Broussard entered without invitation, noting how Alcide's hands remained steady despite what must be coming. The button collection lay spread across the table, dozens of gleaming pieces arranged in perfect rows, each one positioned with mathematical exactness. "The engraving on the button found with Marie's remains," Broussard said, taking a seat across from the old man. "It's recent work, within the last decade." Alcide's fingers continued their polishing motion, though no button lay beneath them now. "Modern forensics are quite remarkable, aren't they? Much more sophisticated than what was available in 1941. You planted that evidence, all of it. The journal pages the button, even the chains securing the remains. You've been managing this crime scene for 25 years. Managing? Alcide seemed to consider the word. Yes, I suppose that's accurate, though I prefer to think of it as curating, ensuring the proper narrative emerged when the time was right. The confession came without dramatics, delivered in the same measured tone Alcide had used to describe his granddaughter's disappearance. Broussard felt a chill at the man's complete lack of remorse. What happened that evening, Alcide? What really happened to Marie and Celeste? Alcide set down his polishing cloth and folded his hands with deliberate care. They were so beautiful that evening, 15 and 17 blooming into womanhood, when I found them swimming in their undergarments, laughing and splashing like water nymphs. His eyes grew distant. I had raised them to be pure detective, modest, but there they were displaying themselves like common girls. The truth spilled out in clinical detail, how Alcide had approached them at the swimming hole, ostensibly to escort them home. How his lectures about modesty had turned to inappropriate touching, how Marie had tried to run when she understood his intentions, and how Celeste had screamed for help that never came. I never intended to hurt them, Alcide said quietly. But they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't understand that I only wanted to guide them properly. The chains from my boat anchor were nearby. It seemed the most efficient solution. Efficient solution? Broussard repeated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. You murdered your own granddaughters. Alcide's expression remained eerily calm. I corrected a situation that had gotten out of hand. Marie fought harder than I expected such spirit in that child. But Celeste, poor Celeste, simply went limp with shock. I believe she understood in the end that this was necessary. The old man's fingers returned to the brass buttons, arranging them in ever more precise patterns. Afterward, I weighted their bodies with the anchor chains and placed them in the deepest part of the channel. I knew those waters would preserve them until I decided the time was right for discovery. Broussard struggled to maintain his professional composure. 25 years, Alcide. You spent 25 years pretending to search for them, knowing exactly where they were. I was searching, detective. Not for their bodies, I always knew where those lay, but for the perfect resolution. I collected evidence from Henri Baptiste and Claude over the years. Henri's journals from his cabin when he was drunk, pages from Baptiste's prayer books during confession preparations, Claude's angry writings whenever he'd been drinking and feeling sorry for himself. The meticulous planning was staggering. Alcide had cultivated his image as the devoted grandfather, while systematically gathering material to frame 3 innocent men. He'd known that modern forensics would eventually demand answers, so he'd prepared a buffet of suspects for investigators to choose from. The journal was my masterpiece, Alcide continued with obvious pride. I bound their writings together in an old leather cover, sealed it properly, and submerged it near the remains just 3 years ago. Long enough for appropriate water damage, but not long enough to destroy the evidence entirely. And the brass button? My signature, you might say. I intended it to implicate my deceased son Jacques, another layer of confusion. But you proved more thorough than I anticipated. Alcide's smile was cold and satisfied. No matter. The community has its answers now. 3 suspects with clear motives. Even if you somehow prove my involvement, who would believe that a grandfather could? He let the sentence hang, knowing the truth was almost too horrible to accept. The devoted patriarch who'd spent decades searching for his beloved granddaughters was the very monster who'd destroyed them. Broussard reached for his handcuffs, but Alcide raised a hand with the same measured authority he'd wielded for 73 years. There's no need for dramatics, detective. I'll come quietly. The old man rose from his chair with dignified precision, straightening his shirt and ensuring that brass button caught the light one final time. I've been preparing for this moment longer than you might imagine. As Broussard read him his rights, Alcide moved through his house with the careful attention of someone taking a final inventory. He touched the photographs of Marie and Celeste, adjusted a crooked picture frame, and picked up his polishing cloth to return it to its designated drawer. You feel no remorse, Broussard observed, watching this ritualistic farewell. Remorse implies wrongdoing, Alcide replied. I loved those girls more than anyone ever could. I protected them from a world that would have corrupted their innocence. They remain pure forever now, detective. Isn't that what every grandfather wants for his granddaughters? The absolute conviction in his voice was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire confession. Alcide Boudreaux genuinely believed he had acted out of love, not violence. In his twisted logic, murder had been an act of preservation. Outside, as Broussard helped Alcide into the patrol car, the old man looked toward the bayou one last time. The water keeps its secrets until we're ready to face them, he said quietly. I've given the community what it needed: closure, suspects, and the comfort of believing evil looks like Henri or Baptiste or Claude. Not like a devoted grandfather who reads bedtime stories and polishes brass buttons. As they drove away from the homestead, Broussard reflected on how perfectly Alcide had hidden behind 25 years of apparent devotion. The community would struggle to accept that their most trusted elder had been their greatest monster. Evil often wore the most familiar faces, hiding behind the very virtues, love, protection, guidance that people held most sacred. But the Bayou had finally released its terrible secret. Marie and Celeste Boudreaux could rest knowing their killer would face justice, even if that justice came a quarter century too late. As Broussard drove through the darkness, he squeezed the steering wheel tighter. "Some truths are worth waiting for," he whispered to the night air. Even 25 years. The headlights cut through the Louisiana darkness, illuminating a future where the girls' spirits could finally find peace one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.